"Here I am the law, you're just a parasite," Officer Briggs shouted, pressing his gun against Naomi Carter's temple in the middle of a packed shopping mall. The crowd froze, thinking she would crumble under the barrel, but Naomi calmly pulled out her FBI badge and said through clenched teeth, "Don't you know your name's already in my abuse investigation file?" The sudden reversal blew the place wide open, turning the public humiliation into a lesson in justice. Where are you living where cops believe they are the law until justice exposes them? It was lunchtime rush hour, and the shopping mall was packed. Loudspeakers blared over and over from the stores, sometimes pushing promotions, sometimes blasting background music that drowned out the hurried footsteps on the polished stone floor. Bright white lights from hundreds of decorative bulbs cast down reflections on the glass storefronts, making the whole space feel even more glaring and stifling. Groups of people squeezed past one another, arms full of shopping bags, voices and laughter mixing into an endless current. In the middle of that chaos, Naomi Carter calmly stepped out of a store, holding nothing but a small paper bag. Her face was composed, her pace unhurried, as if the noise and rush around her had no bearing. That quiet poise caught a few eyes because in a sea of hustle, she stood out like stillness in a storm. From the opposite direction, a large figure pushed through the crowd and came to a stop in the walkway. Officer Briggs, wearing his usual smug expression, stepped forward, prompting a few people nearby to move aside. He eyed Naomi with scrutiny, his gaze traveling from the paper bag in her hand to her calm face, as if trying to sniff out a mistake to mock. After a brief pause, Briggs raised his voice just enough for everyone around to hear, "I just saw you hide an unpaid item." The accusation sliced through the noisy air like a sharp blade, making footsteps slow and drawing a wave of glances toward the scene. The wide hallway suddenly felt cramped heavy with suspicion. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her eyes steady and unmoved. She looked straight at Briggs, her voice even, and composed each word hanging in the air. "You should be careful with your accusations." She didn't raise her voice or sound defensive, yet her clean response made several bystanders frown. A few stopped altogether, phones already drawn screens glowing as they began recording the unusual scene. The small lights from cameras reflected in the eyes of those involved, making the moment feel even more charged. Briggs hesitated for a beat, then smirked coldly, stepping forward half a pace to block the path entirely, his shadow stretching across the floor like it meant to swallow Naomi whole. In the crowd, some people whispered with suspicion in their voices, and others shook their heads in frustration. A couple, walking with their young child, paused at the scene visibly uneasy, then quickly steered their child away, though they glanced back with confusion in their eyes. A group of teens had stopped, eyes flickering with curiosity and anticipation, whispering among themselves while keeping their phones pointed forward. The once busy hallway, filled with footsteps and chatter, had quieted down, giving way to a moment of confrontation. Briggs sneered, raising his voice so everyone nearby could hear, "You think you'll get away with this? I saw it with my own eyes. Stop pretending you're innocent." He didn't need proof, didn't offer any explanation. His words carried the smug pleasure of a man enjoying the act of publicly humiliating a woman of color. Naomi didn't respond right away. She slowly and deliberately placed the paper bag on the floor. The motion drew even more attention. Seeing it, Briggs grew more confident, convinced he had her cornered. His voice sharpened, cold and commanding. "Raise your hands. Show everyone you have nothing to hide." A few scoffs came from the crowd, but one hesitant voice objected. "What's he doing? There's no proof." Briggs snapped his gaze toward the speaker, his eyes so cold that the person immediately fell silent, lowering their head and backing away. The atmosphere thickened, cloaked in the shadow of unchecked power. Naomi took a deep breath, shoulders square, eyes locked on Briggs. Her voice rang out steady and clear, not rushed but deeply resonant. "I warned you. Be careful with your words. A baseless accusation can become your own burden." Her tone carried no fear, only an icy reminder. A few in the crowd gave subtle nods, recognizing the truth in what she said. Briggs Briggs, on the other hand, was visibly rattled, a vein bulging at his temple. He wasn't used to the target of his pressure staying this calm. The overhead announcements abruptly cut off, leaving an unnatural silence where every whisper and breath could be heard. The wide hallway suddenly felt smaller, the tension so thick it slowed every movement. Briggs stepped in closer, his breath brushing the narrow space between them laced with a harsh smell of cigarettes. He lowered his voice, but still loud enough for the crowd to catch. "Here I decide who's right and who's wrong." The words dropped like a hammer, a direct challenge to every idea of justice people believed in. Naomi didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked cold as a blade cutting through the mask of authority Briggs wore. That silence, stretching just a few seconds, held everyone's breath. A few cameras trembled in the hands that held them, capturing every expression, every motion. Briggs grew increasingly impatient, his face flushed red with rage as he stood against the woman's quiet resolve. The surrounding crowd stirred louder whispers, rippling outward like waves, but no one dared to step in. All eyes remained fixed on the scene where a police officer flaunted his power with groundless accusations, and a woman of color stood tall, unmoving, like a marker planted in the middle of a human tide. In that moment, the picture came into sharp focus. A white man wrapped in the arrogance of authority, raising his voice in accusation. A woman of color, entirely composed, unshaken. And a crowd at once, curious and outraged, holding phones like third eyes, witnessing and recording it all. That contrast branded itself into the minds of everyone present, turning this encounter into the spark for a storm no one would be able to put out once it broke loose. The main hallway of the shopping mall blazed under white lights stretching from the ceiling to the floor. Digital billboards streamed non-stop bursts of vivid color, sometimes fashion, sometimes music, but no one was watching anymore. Every eye was fixed on the center of the human circle where Briggs and Naomi stood face to face. The tension in the air was so tight it felt like even the ceiling lights were trembling under the pressure of what was about to explode. Briggs drew in a sharp breath, veins bulging on his neck, and shouted in a hoarse, furious voice, "Stop pretending you're innocent. I know you're kind." The words echoed, slamming into the glass walls and bouncing back, silencing the once noisy corridor with the harsh sting of insult. A group of students near the food court looked around in alarm, some covering their mouths, others raising their phones higher to make sure they didn't miss a second. Naomi stood still, her gaze locked on Briggs, her face disturbingly calm. She slowly raised both hands, not in haste but with intention, as if to show everyone she had nothing to hide. Her voice rang out, not loud, but clear enough for each person in the circle to hear, "You're crossing the line." The words hit like ice, reflecting back the twisted rage on Briggs's face like a mirror. The crowd stirred. Someone whispered, "She's really standing up to him." A middle-aged man tugged his wife's arm and muttered, "This isn't a routine check anymore. He's losing control." While Naomi remained composed, Briggs couldn't bear the feeling of his authority being challenged in public. He clenched his teeth and his right hand slid down to his belt. The crowd caught the movement and burst into alarm, many people stepping back, a few children beginning to scream. In that suffocating instant, Briggs drew his gun, its cold steel catching the white light. He aimed it directly at Naomi's face, so close his breath still lingered around the dark muzzle. His voice dropped into a threat, each word landing like a hammer. "Get on your knees if you don't want to die right here." The shout tore through the air, shaking the entire floor. Panic erupted. Screams rang out across the hallway. Some people rushed toward the emergency stairs, but most stood frozen, hypnotized by the scene. Dozens of phone cameras lit up their flashes, flickering, turning the corridor into a makeshift film set. Someone whispered, trembling, "Oh my God, he's pointing a gun right in the middle of the mall." A young woman clutched her friend's hand, her voice shaken. "If she really kneels, it'll be like admitting guilt when she did nothing wrong." Her friend answered, furious, "But she doesn't look like someone who's going to back down." Naomi stared directly into the dark muzzle of the gun inches from her face, her eyes clear, untouched by panic. Flashing through her mind were memories of brutal training sessions, tense hours on the field where every second demanded steady breathing and a cold heart in the face of crisis. All those experiences converged in this moment when she knew a single wrong move could turn the entire hallway into tragedy. But Naomi didn't flinch, didn't move, letting her calm stand in stark contrast to the madness unraveling before her. Briggs, caught in his fury, tried to keep his face hard, but the tremble in his finger on the trigger betrayed the chaos inside. He panted, sweat beating on his forehead, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes piercing him like needles to the skin. He shouted louder, trying to drown out his own unraveling. "You all see this, right? People like her always think they can stand equal to the law, but I am the law." His voice boomed, bouncing off the glass walls. But what came back was a wave of angry shouts, people yelling, "Put the gun down, he's lost it." The protest was no longer whispered fear, but open outrage. On the outer edge of the crowd, a few mall security guards appeared, but when they saw the weapon in Briggs's hand, they froze, unwilling to move closer. One young guard clutched his radio, his hands shaken as he called for backup, but his eyes stayed fixed on Naomi. The sight of a woman standing firm in front of a loaded gun, hands raised, gaze steady and fearless, left him stunned. The crowd was locked in, two more phones buzzing with live stream alerts, the image of Briggs and Naomi now broadcasting live across social platforms. Naomi took a long breath, feeling the slow, steady beat of her heart, and her voice rang out calm and low, each word hitting the floor like a hammer. "You've made yourself the one outside the law." That calm sparked soft cheers in the crowd, a flicker of belief that justice still stood here even with a gun aimed at its face. Briggs shook his head, eyes bloodshot, trying to bury his fear beneath a roar. "Shut up, or I'll make you the lesson for every one of your kind." The muzzle shifted slightly now, just inches from Naomi's face. Shouts, cries, and the constant clicking of recording phones merged into a storm of chaos that swept through the hallway. The crowd was no longer passive. They began shouting in protest. A few people nearby gathered the courage to yell out, "She's innocent. He's abusing his power." The force of public outrage, rising like a flood, pushed Briggs into an increasingly dangerous corner. Still, he held firm, his hand stiff, his eyes burning with madness. In that moment, the contrast became absolute on one side, violent authority shouting and armed. On the other, calm defiance, standing tall without yielding. The brightly lit corridor of the shopping mall, with glowing advertisements flickering in the background, had turned into a stage for a confrontation no one could look away from. Every eye, every camera lens recorded it all, and within minutes the world would know that in a public place a police officer had dragged himself into disgrace while a woman of color turned silence into a weapon that stirred the crowd to life. The circle of people around Naomi and Briggs grew thicker by the minute, their faces shifting from curiosity to tension, then swelling with fear and fury. The early shouting had quieted into a heavy silence thick enough to catch every rushed breath, every pounding heartbeat. No one could believe what they were witnessing in the middle of a shopping mall, a place meant for shopping and laughter. Briggs still stood tall, the gun in his hand like a twisted key controlling the very air. He craned his neck and roared, hurling each word at Naomi like lashes. "Who do you think you are? You're just a parasite in this society." The words cut sharply, soaked in contempt, as if meant to tear away every shred of dignity from the woman in front of him. Naomi held her stance, arms raised, body upright like a pillar. Her gaze didn't flinch, locked straight into Briggs's bloodshot eyes. Her voice rose steady and deep, not loud yet. It carried through the entire hallway, each word hidden like a strike. Dignity can't be erased by the pull of a trigger. The line echoed off the glass walls, reaching the far edges of the crowd, making some nod slowly. Others inhale sharply as if drawn strength from her calm. In that pressurized space, Naomi's answer sliced through the fog of fear like a blade, turning silent tension into visible resolve. In the crowd, an elderly woman with silver hair stood at the front, gripping her cane with trembling hands, then suddenly cried out, her voice raspy but strong. "Let her go!" The shout struck like a match to powder, igniting a chorus of voices that followed in an instant. Briggs snapped his head toward her, his hand flinching off the trigger for half a beat, swinging his other arm in a threatening gesture that made the old woman stumble back, nearly falling. A young man caught her just in time, his furious eyes locked on Briggs. The officer growled, his glare wild, throwing threats at anyone who dared to speak. No one stepped forward, but the wave of protest continued to roll through the hallway. The silence from earlier had broken, replaced now by a storm of outrage crashing against every wall. The shouting, the cries, the sound of children weeping all merged into a chaotic symphony. Yet, amid it all, dozens of phones stayed raised, their lenses fixed on the center of the unfolding tragedy. Near the staircase, a young man whispered to his friend, his hands shaking, "I'm live streaming this. Thousands are already watching," his friend replied, eyes still glued to the scene. "Keep going. The world needs to see this." The footage was shaky, blurred by trembling fingers, but every frame was unmistakably clear. A white police officer screaming insults at a black woman, a gun pressed near her face, and dozens of witnesses rising in fury. Briggs turned back to face Naomi, the gun in his hand, still trembling, though he masked the shake with a rising fury. He hissed through clenched teeth, loud enough for the entire circle to hear, "You're just a nobody. You think your silence is going to make me back down?" But Naomi didn't respond right away. Her gaze held steady, her lips pressed tight, and then she spoke slowly, her voice calm but sharp as steel. "People are only nobodies when they accept being buried. No one has the right to strip away dignity." The words drained the color from Briggs's face, the veins in his neck pulsing wildly because he knew the crowd had heard her, and each word was landing like a hammer blow against the authority he was trying to cling to. The crowd felt renewed. The shouting grew louder, waves of protest rolling non-stop. A man in a suit yelled, "He's abusing his power." A young woman, eyes wet, clutching her phone, whispered, "She's so brave." Voices came from every direction, turning the brightly lit corridor with its flashing ads into a public courtroom where Briggs was now being tried by witnesses and camera lenses alike. Briggs still tried to dominate with venomous shouting. He roared the gun, pressing closer, "Kneel, or I'll show everyone what happens to those who challenge the law." But instead of fear, the cries of resistance grew stronger. Someone yelled, "Justice doesn't live in your gun." Another screamed, "Let her go." The whole hallway erupted. Bystanders had become witnesses, and now those witnesses were turning into a chorus unified against abuse. Naomi drew in a deep breath, eyes fixed on the barrel, and spoke again, her voice firm and low. "The louder you scream, the more you reveal your own fear. As for me, I'm still standing because justice never kneels." The crowd exploded cheers, drowning out Briggs's yelling. Some people moved in closer, not to intervene, but to get the clearest shot on camera. A shaft of light from the ceiling beamed directly down, casting Naomi in the center of it all, unmissable. Everything seemed to slow down. Briggs raged on, but his eyes wavered as he saw the sea of people turning against him. No one was silent anymore. Every phone raised 1,000 eyes, capturing the moment. And in that instant he realized the power of his weapon was being crushed by the force of truth and unity. But instead of stopping, he shouted louder, voice hoarse, "Stop filming! That's an order!" The desperate command was met with laughter and whistles tearing through the air, shredding the last illusion of control he had worn with his uniform. The scene had spun out of control. The shopping mall was no longer just a place for buying and selling. It had become an arena where brute power clashed with unyielding dignity. Naomi still stood tall. Briggs still aimed his gun, but the balance of power had shifted. It was no longer fear, but collective outrage, no longer silence, but a unified voice. And every second of it, every frame was being recorded, ready to burst beyond these glass walls and ignite a society already far too familiar with injustice. The sound of an alarm rang through the shopping mall, loud and relentless like a war drum urging the storm that had been building. Red lights across the ceiling began to flash in unison, turning the bright hallway into something strange, a blend of chaos and danger. The crowd jolted in panic, many stepping back, but no one left. Everyone seemed nailed in place by the scene unfolding at the center of the circle. A few mall security guards rushed in, shirts soaked in sweat, their radios crackling with static and frantic voices, but they froze when they saw the gun in Briggs's hand. None dared step into the space where the barrel pointed, their hesitation clear, and each slow step eyes flickering between duty and fear. Briggs tilted his head slightly, a smirk curling on his lips, his teeth grinding audibly as his bloodshot eyes stayed locked on Naomi. "Here I am the law." He spat each word out, his voice thick and heavy, flung into the air like a madman's declaration. The crowd went still again. Those closest could hear every sharp breath he took, could smell the gunpowder from the Glock clutched in his hand. A few people shuddered, eyes wide at the raw arrogance before them, as if Briggs were pouring his entire soul into a twisted vision of power he believed was absolute. Naomi didn't blink. She stood there, the glow from the digital billboard behind her reflecting off her calm face, her eyes steady and deep, as if trying to pierce through the mask of power Briggs wore. She spoke, her voice even and cold, cutting straight into him. "The law doesn't live in your gun." The words were clean, not shouted, but their weight stirred the crowd. A few hesitant claps came from the back, quickly silenced by Briggs's threatening glare. Her response struck like a blade to his pride, and his face went pale, then flushed, the muscles in his cheeks twitching with rage. He growled and stepped closer, the barrel lifting higher now, just inches away, cold enough to feel against the skin. His breath hit her face thick with stale smoke and the bitter tang of metal. His voice cracked out hoarse with rage. "I could shoot you, and no one would save you." The last words tore through the air like fabric ripping, shaking the entire hallway with raw threat. A few people screamed. A child burst into tears in its mother's arms. Someone raised a hand to cover their eyes, but still peeked through trembling fingers, unable to look away from the choking moment. Naomi held her ground. Her face didn't flinch. Her breathing slow and steady, like in those long-ago training sessions where every movement, every glance was drilled to stay centered in the face of chaos. Her eyes lit with a quiet intensity, cold, unwavering, as if she were standing on a familiar battlefield, one where life and death had tested her before. The crowd held its breath. Every small motion she made seemed to carry the weight of the outcome. A middle-aged man whispered to his son behind her, "Look closely, that's real courage." The air felt crushed thick and heavy on the chests of everyone present. No one dared make a sudden move, as if even the slightest sound could push Briggs to pull the trigger. The guards stood outside the circle, gripping their radios tightly, but none stepped in. The fire in Briggs's eyes and the black barrel of his gun were a wall no one could pass. The phones in the crowd stayed raised, their screens glowing lenses trembling but never turning away. Every eye was locked on the razor-thin space between the muzzle and Naomi's face. Briggs clenched his teeth, sweat dripping from his temples, sliding down his cheeks and disappearing at his jawline. He forced a smile, but it twisted awkwardly, cracking open the fear beneath. He repeated himself, voice hoarse, almost a howl. "No one's gonna save you. I'll make you disappear right in front of them." But Naomi didn't bow her head. She took a breath, her shoulders firm, eyes locked straight on him, steady. In that moment, her silence became a wall that sent his shouting ricocheting back, breaking apart in the same heavy air he had filled with threat. The crowd felt the shift. Someone muttered, "He's losing control," and another followed, "She's still standing, he's the one shaking." Those small whispers spread like sparks, catching dry grass, circling the crowd. Briggs heard them, and it made him more frantic. He raised the gun higher, his hand trembling with rage and pressure. But that very tremble, captured by the rolling cameras, became proof, a truth that couldn't be undone. He no longer held control. Naomi's voice stayed low, but it echoed like a final blow cracking through Briggs's pride. "The more you push me, the more you show that it's you who's afraid." The crowd let out a collective breath. A single, "That's right," rose from the back, triggering more voices in support. Briggs shook his head, his eyes darting wildly, his lips muttering as if to calm himself. But it was too late. Everyone had seen it, everyone had heard it, and the truth could no longer be hidden. The entire hallway froze, the air stiffening as if time itself had stopped. The billboards kept flashing with glittering images, but no one noticed every eye was fixed on the thin gap between the gun barrel and Naomi's forehead. A single bead of sweat slid from Briggs's temple and dropped to the stone floor, shattering softly, the small sound echoing in the silence. The crowd held its breath, hearts pounding like they might break free from their chests. Every gaze locked on that moment between life and death, where truth and lies were being pushed to their limits. And there, under harsh light and blaring alarms, the whole world was being forced to witness a scene no one would ever forget. The tension inside the shopping mall had reached a point where it felt like a single breath could make it explode. The alarm kept screaming, but it had faded from the minds of the crowd because at the center of that circle only two people remained: Briggs, with a trembling gun in his hand, and Naomi standing tall, eyes calm. Hearts pounded and every chest thudding in unison, fast and breathless. In the moment when the barrel nearly touched Naomi's forehead and the silence so thick even the wind seemed swallowed, Naomi slowly slid her right hand into her jacket pocket. Eyes widened everywhere. Someone shouted in warning, and others gasped mid-breath, fearing she was about to make a fatal move. Briggs tightened his grip, tendons bulging in his hand, eyes locked in a wild stare on her every movement. But Naomi didn't draw a weapon, didn't pull out anything to resist. From her pocket, she carefully removed a dark brown leather wallet, worn but perfectly intact along every stitch. She raised it to eye level, her motion deliberate, as if inviting everyone to see. Under the red, flashing lights of the alarm, a shining metal badge caught the air. FBI badge, a symbol of justice, made visible, reflecting light like lightning cutting through a storm-filled sky. The murmurs in the crowd erupted into gasps. Phones zoomed in from all angles, screens trembling in hands but never looking away. Some people fell silent in awe. Others screamed out as if witnessing something unreal. Naomi didn't lower her hand. She held the blazing badge right at eye level with the hundreds standing around, framed by flashing lights and the chaos of sirens. Her voice rang out, firm and clear, each word slamming against the wall of arrogance behind the gun. "Your name, Briggs, is already in my abuse investigation file." Her voice didn't need to rise, didn't need to shout. It cracked like thunder through a hallway that had fallen dead silent. The crowd froze, then instantly burst into chaos. Shouts, curses, cheers all collided and surged back toward Briggs, whose face turned pale. His eyes went wide. The hand holding the gun shook visibly. His face flushed red as if the mask of authority had just been torn apart. Just seconds later, Briggs tried to regain control, shouting hoarsely, his voice cracking as he tried to mask the fear now plain on his face. "Don't listen to her. She's lying." But the shout rang hollow against the rising wave around him. The cameras in the witnesses' hands had already captured everything. Naomi holding up her FBI badge, her sharp declaration, Briggs's pale, panicked face, and now his weak, rushed denial. The crowd no longer feared him. Their anger transformed into a deafening roar. Someone yelled, "FBI! She's FBI!" Another voice followed. "He's exposed now." The shouts grew louder, rising up to the high ceilings of the mall, spreading like a tsunami that drowned out every excuse. Briggs staggered back a step, sweat pouring down his forehead, the hand holding the gun starting to falter. His eyes darted around wildly, searching for an escape, but all he saw was a sea of phones raised, dozens of lenses pointed straight at him like interrogation lights. No more silence from past victims, no more shadows to hide, and everything was being dragged into the light. Naomi still stood tall, her hand holding the badge high, her eyes steady. Her voice came again, low but firm. "There's no way out. out now, Briggs." From the crowd, a middle-aged man shouted. "I saw him beat someone in the street," a young woman added. "That's him. I reported it," but no one listened. Their voices fell like a rain of hammers smashing the mask Briggs had worn for so long. He screamed in desperation, "Shut up, all of you!" But his voice cracked, no longer a threat, only the broken wail of a man being unmasked. Briggs tried to raise the gun again, the barrel trembling, but every time he opened his mouth, the crowd's shouts drowned him out. He looked at Naomi, eyes confused, then turned to the crowd, seeing no fear, only fury and disgust. His name, Briggs, echoed over and over, tangled with accusations pushing him to the edge. Naomi lowered her voice just enough for him to hear, but the calm in her words carried across the space. "You walked yourself into this, Briggs, and the whole world will see it." A young man, live streaming, whispered into his mic, "Look at this, she's FBI, and he's the one shaken." The footage spread fast, view count climbing, comments pouring in, all eyes turning toward what had just unfolded. The truth had broken past the glass walls, past the mall, spilling into cities, into social media. Briggs, surrounded by eyes, cameras, and justice, had no way out. The crowd was no longer holding its breath. They cheered, they clapped, they chanted Naomi's name. An elderly woman raised a trembling hand and shouted, "Justice has arrived." A group of students yelled, "He's been exposed." Those voices surged forward, drowning out the alarm, overwhelming even Briggs's fading screams. In the eyes of the people, he had already fallen. There was no need for a courtroom verdict because the judgment of the public had already landed. Naomi stood tall, her eyes shining under the flashing lights, her hand still raised with the FBI badge, a symbol no one could deny. And then, in the middle of the uproar, Briggs stepped back, his hand shaking, his eyes blank. The gun wobbled in his grip and fell to the cold stone floor with a sharp clang that echoed down the hallway. The crowd erupted applause and shouting, crashing like a tidal wave. Briggs collapsed, his shoulders trembling, his face pale, while Naomi remained standing like a warrior who had won not through force, but through resolve and truth. That reversal had turned the entire space into living proof of a simple truth. Justice may arrive late, but when it does, it can tear through every disguise of abuse. That evening, as the mall's alarms fell silent and the hallways returned to their usual brightness, filled with the sound of footsteps, the first storm broke out online. Twitter, now renamed X, was flooded with photos and videos from the phones pointed at Briggs and Naomi just hours earlier. A clip, barely a minute long, showing Naomi standing still under Briggs's gun, her face calm to the point of cold, her hands raised without a trace of panic, became the center of attention. It was shared as living proof of the power of composure with a bold caption stamped across it, "Unshaken." That meme spread like wildfire, evolving from a few posts into a flood of edited images, soundtracks, and quotes, turning Naomi into a symbol of defiance within just a few short hours. Hashtags exploded, appearing simultaneously across timelines. Mall incident shot to the #1 trending spot in less than 2 hours, followed by #FBI Vaz Cop, catching fire as millions of users joined the conversation. Anyone browsing social media that night couldn't avoid seeing the image Briggs with a trembling gun in hand, Naomi calmly staring him down next to the caption, "Dignity can't be erased by a trigger." The numbers spiked by the minute, thousands, then tens of thousands of retweets, comments pouring in from countries around the world. The story had already gone beyond the mall, beyond the state, beyond national borders. It had become a global event. A major account with millions of followers posted in blunt outrage. He pointed a gun at an FBI agent. "He's finished." The tweet racked up hundreds of thousands of likes within the hour, shared widely, followed by a flood of replies. People weren't just furious at Briggs. They were in awe of Naomi, a black woman who stayed calm with death staring her in the face. One comment read, "This isn't regular bravery. This is justice made real." Another said, "I've never seen someone anyone stand like that with a gun in their face. Across forums, the clip was analyzed from every angle. Some slowed it down frame by frame, circling Briggs's shaken hand on the gun, then zooming in on Naomi's eyes, calm as still water. One account posted the breakdown with the caption, "The one trembling wasn't her, it was him." Those words spread like cracks across the wall Briggs once believed was unbreakable. The video itself began morphing into countless versions, some set to epic music, some overlaid with outraged voiceovers and even short animated sketches showing Briggs shaking just before Naomi raised her badge. The view count rose at a pace that stunned everyone. A 10-second clip of Naomi raising her FBI badge, the light reflecting off it as it gleamed within the circle of people, hit 1 million views in just 30 minutes. By midnight, the number had jumped to 5 million, then 10 million, like a fire that couldn't be put out. Comments flooded in beneath each clip, people sharing, adding chants, clapping emojis, and capitalized outrage. "Fire him now, justice won't kneel." She stood for all of us. The emotions surged, not just fury, but deep admiration for Naomi, the woman who turned everything around on the spot. It wasn't just Twitter, every platform exploded. TikTok is filled with fast-cut videos from the scene, set to urgent music with the flashing words, "Unshaken." Instagram overflowed with screenshots from the clip, captions becoming slogans. "Justice doesn't flinch. A bullet can't kill the truth." YouTube quickly hosted 10-minute breakdowns, commentators analyzing every word, every gesture, every look. The whole world was watching Briggs as the face of corruption, Naomi as the embodiment of unshakable strength. At a small cafe in Washington, a group of students spoke in rapid bursts. A young woman opened her laptop, pointed to the screen, and said, voice full of emotion, "This part, look at her eyes. So calm, it's unreal." Her friend replied, "That's real strength," and he was shaking. Conversations like this echoed everywhere from offices to classrooms, from sidewalks to bars. The incident had gone beyond being just an event. It had become a mirror reflecting long-standing injustice and, at the same time, proof of the power in standing tall without backing down. Naomi, meanwhile, quietly returned home, keeping her distance from the media noise for the moment. But she couldn't stop her image from spreading across screens big and small. Messages poured in, calls kept coming, all of them telling her that the moment in the mall no longer belonged only to her, it belonged to the public now, to the millions searching for a sliver of light in the dark shadow of abuse. Briggs, in contrast, became the subject of disgrace. His image, trembling, shouting in desperation with a gun in hand, was frozen into a symbol of shame. Mocking memes appeared everywhere, from cartoon sketches to bold text overlays reading, "You're done," across his stunned expression. Some even placed his face next to historical oppressors with the caption, "When evil is exposed on camera, collapses on its own." Public opinion judged him faster and harsher than any courtroom ever could. Within just a few hours, the entire story had turned into an unprecedented media phenomenon. People kept sharing, commenting, analyzing, and judging. Every hashtag became a symbol, every clip a piece of evidence. An entire society was fixated on that moment, the moment Naomi stood calmly under the barrel of a gun, then flipped the situation with nothing but a bat. And that very momentum opened a new chapter 1, where Briggs could no longer hide, where justice was no longer distant, but real in every tap, every share, every unified voice. It didn't take long, society seemed to erupt in unison. By the next morning, from small corner cafes to crowded lecture halls, from student dorm rooms to late-lit office buildings, the story of Naomi and Briggs had become the center of every conversation. In a packed cafe downtown, every table turned into a debate space, phone screens glowing bright, the clip of Naomi beneath Briggs's gun playing over and over, accompanied by furious commentary. A young journalist known for sharp takes on social media posted a single line that drew hundreds of thousands of likes within hours. When justice has a gun pointed at its face, the answer is not fear, it's standing tall. The sentence struck like a declaration, spreading rapidly, screenshot bolded and posted across major news sites. In student dorms, the story burned hotter than the upcoming exams. In one cramped room, filled with chatter and laughter, a group of students ate instant noodles while watching the clip on a laptop. A young man pointed at the screen, voice full of anger. "See that?" He pulled the gun first. No reason at all. A girl cut in. This isn't the first time a cop's abused power, but this time he picked the wrong person. Their words blended with bitter laughs. Then silence fell again as Naomi's line rang out. "Dignity can't be erased by a trigger." The room went quiet. Then a wave of applause broke out as if she were standing right there with them. In offices where crisp suits were used to stiff silence, even those walls couldn't block it out. Between stacks of paperwork, a young employee turned their phone toward a colleague and said firmly, "He just ended his career." Another shook their head and replied, "Not just his career, the whole system behind him is shaking." In those brief pauses between tasks, work talk faded. People spoke about the truth now exposed and about Naomi now seen as a torch newly lit. The outrage wasn't just in words, it took form across social media. Countless personal stories were posted, accounts of being pulled over for no reason, yelled at on the street, searched without cause. One man wrote, "When I was 17, I was pulled from a car just because of my skin. I stayed silent and endured. But today, seeing Naomi, I realized that silence fed men like Briggs." Beneath his post, thousands of comments echoed in solidarity, sharing similar experiences. What once felt like isolated memories had now joined into a collective indictment of an entire system. On YouTube, a slow-motion breakdown video became the center of attention. The creator paused, frame by frame, circling Briggs's hand as he drew his gun, comparing it with the moment Naomi still stood completely still, her hands unmoved. The narrator's voice rang clear. "This is undeniable evidence. Briggs was the aggressor. Naomi simply faced abuse of power." The video quickly reached millions of views, shared across legal and security forums, and even cited in live television panel discussion. No one could twist the truth anymore. Every frame told the story plainly. Small protests began to form. In a major public square, dozens gathered holding up signs with drawings of Naomi and the word "unshaken" beneath. The signs were hastily colored, but her steady gaze was captured in full-stopping passers-by in their tracks. Some paused to take photos, immediately posting them with captions like, "We stand with Naomi." In another city, a group of law students organized an emergency forum, dozens packed into a lecture hall listening as a professor explained, "That moment wasn't just a personal conflict, it was a snapshot of a system that let a gun replace justice." Everywhere from buzzing bars to family kitchens, from park benches to classrooms, the outrage kept spreading, connecting strangers through a shared emotional current. People no longer spoke of Briggs as just a man, but as a symbol of warped power that had lasted far too long. And Naomi, once a witness in a single incident, had become a guiding figure, someone whose calm gave others a reason to speak up. The outrage soon reached the national level. Major news outlets ran the story, live panels debated it, and bold headlines exploded across digital front pages. FBI agent faces down cop at mall led the way, followed by editorials exposing similar past incidents. Forgotten fragments of previous cases resurfaced now tied to Briggs, turning him into the poster child for systemic rot in law enforcement. Politicians began issuing statements calling for immediate investigations and affirming that the public deserved clear answers. The viral images, shared stories, analysis videos, and relentless news coverage had merged into an unstoppable flood. The public was no longer a passive audience. They had become a force of judgment, a force demanding change. Briggs was no longer just a police officer. In a single incident, he had become the focal point of national outrage. And Naomi, through her steady stance beneath a gun, had become the flame connecting millions. The wave of outrage didn't stop at cafe conversations or comments under viral clips. Once social media had turned the incident into a national storm, forums and independent news sites jumped in. People skilled at digging up old records, investigative journalists, and even everyday internet users with nothing but an old laptop launched a collective hunt. The target was singular Briggs. His name, now spoken millions of times, had become the focus of an unprecedented campaign to uncover everything buried behind it. Within just a few hours, long-forgotten records were dragged from the bottom of the system. Old, local news blurbs, once confined to a few lines in quick briefs, were resurfaced, magnified, and shared with attached photos. It was discovered that Briggs had been accused multiple times of violent conduct, particularly against black individuals. One case stood out where a young black man was stopped on the street, then brought into the station covered in bruises. At the time, the incident was quickly buried with the report offering only vague words. Subject showed signs of resistance. But now, shown beside the footage of Briggs screaming in the shopping mall, the truth was laid bare. An independent outlet known for tackling uncomfortable stories published a headline investigation: "The man with the gun in the mall wasn't new to violence." The article spread rapidly. It referenced a case from 5 years prior, one that had rocked the black community before fading into silence. The victim was a middle-aged man severely beaten during a vehicle check. His family had cried out to the press, but the case was closed quickly due to lack of evidence. Now, internet users unearthed the old article where one small line read, "Officer involved was Briggs." The story of lost evidence had returned like a reopened wound, sparking fury in thousands. Comments under the article poured in. Lack of evidence because he covered it up. If the system hadn't protected him, how many people could have been saved? Meanwhile, TikTok became a battleground. Past witnesses, those who had been abused by Briggs or seen his actions firsthand, were no longer silent. One short video under a minute, posted by an older man, became a flashpoint. He looked directly into the camera, voice trembling but firm. "It's him. He beat me right in front of my house. I screamed that day, but no one listened because I was just another nameless black man. Today, I can't stay quiet anymore." That video spread instantly, drawing millions of views and thousands of comments filled with shared rage and solidarity. Another woman came forward, her face visibly emotional. "He dragged me out of my car right after I handed over my paperwork. I was beaten so badly that I spent 3 days in the hospital. When I filed a complaint, they said I made it up. I stayed silent for 4 years, but when I saw him pointing a gun at Naomi, I knew I had to speak." Her video was widely shared with comments pouring in. "We believe you. This is no longer an isolated story." These once scattered testimonies now formed a chain, transforming Briggs from an ordinary police officer into the face of systemic abuse of power. On major forums, legal experts began weighing in. One attorney wrote, "If this string of allegations is confirmed, we're looking at a serial abuser protected for decades by the very system meant to hold him accountable." A sociologist added, "This isn't just about Briggs. It reflects deep flaws in how police oversight works." Public pressure intensified. New hashtags surfaced tied to Briggs's past. "Lost evidence is a lie. Victims are no longer silent." Even international media picked up the story. A major European newspaper ran the headline, "America faces yet another nightmare of racial discrimination in law enforcement." The image of Briggs pointing his gun at Naomi as she raised her FBI badge took the front page, but this time alongside old photos from long-buried scandals. They were placed side by side, creating a wide-angle portrait of a man whose history of abuse had been covered up until the truth finally broke through. Television programs quickly joined in. In a live broadcast, a political commentator held up old case files and told millions of viewers, "This isn't an isolated shock. This is the result of years of the system turning its back. Naomi is simply the first to make it impossible for us to look away." The studio erupted in applause, and clips from the segment spread online at lightning speed. Briggs, once a police officer seemingly secure in his uniform, was now fully exposed under the glare of public scrutiny. Every witness who spoke out, every old report uncovered, every buried piece of evidence brought to light, all of it sliced away the layers of his mask. To the public, he was no longer an officer of the law, but a symbol of corrupted power, a man who abused authority without consequence. Naomi, though absent from the media in the days following the incident, remained present in every story. People spoke of her as the one who unlocked a sealed door, allowing years of buried truth to pour into the open. Her words echoed through every comment, every clip. Dignity can't be erased by a trigger. It became a compass, guiding old witnesses to reclaim their voice and helping a whole community turn pain into a unified indictment. In the raging whirlwind of media and social networks, Briggs was no longer just a name. He had become a symbol of corruption, a vivid example of what communities had endured in silence. And now, with the past laid bare and the voices of victims rising in unison, he had no way out. Society as a whole was staring directly at him, not with the downcast eyes of fear, but with the furious gaze of those demanding justice. The morning at the local police department was no longer quiet. In front of the main entrance, crowds had gathered early, hundreds of signs raised under the sun. Their messy but powerful words like arrows aimed straight at the wall of silence inside. Justice for all fire. Briggs. Now each chant echoed in a pounding rhythm, a reminder that justice had taken to the streets and nothing could stop it. Drums, whistles, and marching feet roared like crashing waves surrounding the entire area, shaking the iron barricades under the weight of outrage. The protesters didn't come just from the city, but from neighboring areas as well, bringing with them reporters, photographers, and a sea of television cameras. Police were deployed to maintain order, but even they lowered their gaze before signs showing Briggs pointing a gun with the caption, "System on Trial." The atmosphere was heavy, as if the entire building was being besieged by the truth it had once tried to hide. A middle-aged woman holding a microphone shouted, "We're not staying silent anymore." Her voice echoed by thousands more, thickening the air like spreading fire. Inside, high-ranking police officials rushed through hallways, faces tense. Desk phones rang nonstop, emails piled up, and press releases flooded every surface. They no longer had control over public opinion when every second outside was being live-streamed, every move monitored by millions of eyes. A veteran officer whispered to a colleague, "If we don't have answers now, this chair is shaken to its core." The pressure wasn't just from the crowd. Local politicians, usually silent in sensitive matters, were now speaking up together. One lawmaker appeared on live television stating clearly, "We need an urgent investigation. The public deserves transparency." That statement added fuel to the fire outside, where people cheered, beat drums, and jumped high to show they were waiting for justice. A mayor from another city also posted a message online admitting that silence has become complicity and pledged full support for a comprehensive investigation. On news channels, live footage of the police department under siege aired for hours. Commentators repeatedly emphasized that the system had never been pushed into such a defensive corner. Every slogan, every face in the crowd was analyzed to show this was no longer an isolated incident, but a confrontation between the public and the forces that had hidden the truth. One journalist summed it up bluntly, "If they don't act, they'll lose all trust." Inside a closed room on the third floor, where top-ranking officials were holding an emergency meeting, the tension was so thick it could be sliced into pieces. They argued over how to respond, some urging a press conference to calm the public, others insisting on staying silent to avoid pouring fuel on the fire. But in the end, they all came to the same realization: the only option was to accept launching an urgent investigation. It was no longer a voluntary decision, but the result of overwhelming pressure from the thousands outside, from the millions watching through screens, from the relentless chants echoing without pause. Outside, police sirens mixed with the pounding drums of protest. A child sat on their father's shoulders, holding up a small sign with messy handwriting: "Justice belongs to everyone." A journalist captured the image, which made the front page, instantly becoming the day's symbol. The police department, once a seat of authority, had now turned into the epicenter of judgment, and Briggs, though still unseen, had already been convicted in the public's mind. The pressure came down like a mountain, leaving no room for evasion. The chants of "justice for all" and "fire Briggs" now kept echoing, tireless and unwavering, as a declaration that this fight would not fade until the truth was laid bare. The evening news on national television opened with footage of thousands surrounding the police department's gates, intercut with the now famous clip of Naomi standing motionless under the barrel of a gun played on loop. Right beneath the headline, stretched across the screen, "Cop versus FBI agent," the entire country seemed pulled into a single focal point. Anchors asked pointed questions about oversight, and commentators dissected the incident with brutal honesty. Split screenshots compared Briggs's panicked face with Naomi's steady gaze, repeated again and again to emphasize the stark contrast between the two. Millions watched at home in crowded bars everywhere, drawn into the rising heat of the moment, every word on the screen feeling like a public indictment not only of one man but of the system that enabled him. The media's impact was so intense that no one inside the police department could pretend not to hear it. The dispatch room phones rang non-stop, reporters called demanding answers, and emails from human rights organizations flooded in. Some veteran officers admitted it was the first time the very building they had worked in for years felt like a glass cage, with every move inside scrutinized by millions of eyes outside. Political voices from across the spectrum only added to the pressure, and with each passing news broadcast, the weight doubled. Senior leadership knew that any hesitation now would mean reputational suicide, and the seats of power they once thought unshakable now trembled under the storm. During the late-night emergency meeting, the voice of the head of internal affairs rang out heavy and grave as he admitted they could not delay any longer. For now, the only action that might calm public outrage was the temporary suspension of Briggs. The decision was passed in a room weighed down by tension, no one wanting to be the one to sign, but all knowing that every other option had already been closed. When the official statement was released, television networks immediately ran the headline, "Briggs suspended effective immediately," and cheers erupted from the sea of people outside the precinct gates, rising like crashing waves, drowning out the sound of police sirens. Protesters raised their signs, danced, and embraced one another in triumph. The scene was broadcast live, reaching homes across the country. In a small apartment, a family sat gathered around an old television. The father's eyes lit up at the news, and he quietly told his children, "This is just the first step, but it's a step that had to happen." At a roadside diner, a group of workers clapped together. A waitstaff abandoned their tasks to cheer, and customers raised their phones to capture the moment. Suspending Briggs did not erase the anger, but it ignited a sense of hope, the belief that the community's voice had finally reached a wall once thought unbreakable. For the first time in years, people felt their cries had not vanished into silence, but had become a force pressing a system to yield. In the shadows of the police department building, Briggs sat still, his face gaunt, stripped of the aggressive aura of a man who once believed himself untouchable. He knew the news had spread everywhere, knew his image had become a symbol of corruption, and now even the institution that once protected him had turned its back. The suspension was not just a bureaucratic measure, but a sign of the long days ahead when he would have to face the truth. Outside, the chants of justice for all still echoed through the night. Naomi's image played again and again on TV screens, while Briggs remained in darkness, swallowed by the rising tide of justice. That evening, under the studio lights, a live talk show drew millions of viewers. On the large screen behind the host, the clip of Naomi raising her FBI badge in the middle of the mall was replayed once, then again, then a 10th time. Each frame had become familiar, from the light reflecting off the badge to Briggs's stunned expression, but the audience couldn't look away as its symbolic weight seemed to grow with each replay. The camera panned down to the studio audience, all nodding in unison, some clapping the air thick with the shared tension, as if they had witnessed the moment firsthand. The host spoke in a firm, steady voice. What we saw wasn't just a confrontation. We saw a moment that redefined justice in the eyes of the public. That night's guest was a well-known human rights attorney, someone who had fought in numerous cases against abuse of power. When the clip froze on Naomi standing tall beneath the barrel of a gun, he leaned toward the mic, his eyes lit with a mix of anger and admiration. He said clearly, "This isn't just an incident. It's a symbol." Applause filled the studio, and on screens across millions of homes, his words appeared in large subtitles, etching themselves into the minds of viewers. He went on to explain that Naomi's act of raising her badge wasn't merely a gesture of self-defense, but a public declaration that true authority must be rooted in truth, that the law cannot be bent by those who wield guns to intimidate civilians. In the next segment, the host asked, "So what makes this moment spread so powerfully?" The lawyer replied with conviction, "Because it hit a collective nerve. None of us wants to see weapons used to crush dignity." When Naomi stood tall without bowing, she stood for the millions who had once stayed silent. The studio went quiet for several seconds, then a long round of applause broke out. Some in the audience were visibly moved to tears. Almost instantly on social media, thousands began quoting the lawyer's words, turning them into viral status updates, a shared declaration that this was no longer a personal story. Throughout the broadcast, side screens intercut a stream of images, signs held high in protest, trending hashtags, flooding timelines, and children in public squares lifting lit-up phones, chanting Naomi's name. Each detail layered into the show only deepened the viewer's sense that they were witnessing something pivotal, a moment capable of shaping history. A journalist in the studio added a final comment. Briggs may have thought he was threatening one woman, but in truth, he aimed a gun at an entire community, and Naomi answered on everyone's behalf. As the show ended, the phrase, "Justice doesn't kneel," scrolled across the screen, alongside the image of Naomi holding her badge high, creating a message that spread everywhere. Studio audience members rose to their feet. Viewers at home instantly shared the segment, and within less than an hour, clips from the talk show had flooded social media. From that night on, Naomi was no longer just a witness in an incident. She had become the face of a movement, while Briggs had become a name synonymous with the downfall of twisted authority. That climax marked a turning point as the story officially moved from a specific confrontation into a broader social symbol. Following the talk show, social media erupted again. A new hashtag was born overnight, "Briggs is done." It first appeared in a few comments from well-known accounts, but within hours the phrase topped national trending chart. Millions attached it beneath every video image and post related to the incident. It wasn't just a slogan, it read like a collective verdict against Briggs, declaring that his career and reputation were over. Users kept resharing the clip of Naomi raising her FBI badge, adding a simple caption, "Briggs is done," and we saw it with our own eyes. That wave of data didn't stay online. On the next morning's news programs, anchors were forced to mention the hashtag, analyzing how a police officer was now facing an unprecedented reality, being judged by an entire public through the internet. In op-eds, journalists remarked how rarely someone becomes tied to public disgrace this quickly. quickly. Briggs wasn't just suspended, he had been turned into a mirror for all the anger long stored up against abusers of power. Mocking memes spread everywhere Briggs's pale face as Naomi said his name was edited into countless satirical images. One picture had him standing on a beach with crashing waves behind him, and the words, "Briggs is done," across the frame. Another cartoon showed him holding a gun with a trembling hand, the caption above in bold, "When truth makes a trigger useless." These images flooded forums, turning him into a symbol of collapse. People no longer saw a cop, they saw a man paying for his own arrogance. In real life, that pressure became an undeniable burden. Outside the police station, protesters held signs clearly marked with the new hashtag chanting each word like a firm declaration. The scene was broadcast live, and reporters needed no commentary because every sound from the crowd already carried the full weight of the message. In cafes, baristas worked while chatting, "That guy's done no one's trying to protect him anymore." In lecture halls, law students used the case as an example in class discussions, calling it a social verdict and analyzing the difference between a formal trial and a public wave of judgment. Briggs, by this point, had become a face tied to disgrace. His image no longer belonged to a single incident, it had turned into a negative symbol, a name cited as proof that abused power leads to bitter ends. News segments repeatedly showed the clip intercut, with the leading hashtag etching the truth deeper into public memory. To the people, Briggs was officially erased from the list of those who represent the law, leaving behind only the image of a man undone, swept away by the roaring current of public reckoning. Inside the FBI building, where towering glass panels reflected golden light onto the polished stone floors, the atmosphere had grown more tense than ever. Naomi stepped into the large conference room, a thick file in hand, her gaze as calm as when she faced Briggs's gun. She placed the detailed report on the table, each page documenting the event's witness statements, and the moment she forced Briggs to reveal himself. It was more than a statement, it was the first piece in launching an unprecedented federal investigation. The lead officer flipped through each page, eyebrows furrowed as he read the descriptions of Briggs's behavior, red pen underlining key points that demanded clarification. The room remained silent, broken only by the sound of turning pages and a pen tapping against the table. Shortly after the report was submitted, an urgent decision was made to form a federal investigative task force. An internal meeting was called immediately, and representatives from various departments entered with folders and electronic devices in hand. On the large screen in the center of the room, footage from the mall replayed, and the investigators' eyes were fixed on every detail. Some jotted notes rapidly, others typed non-stop, all absorbed in the gravity of the situation. When the lead investigator spoke, his tone was firm. "This is no longer an isolated incident. This is a gateway to exposing a network of abuse. We will not overlook a single piece of evidence." The atmosphere in the room was tight like a battlefield before deployment. Data maps were displayed showing Briggs's connections to dozens of familiar names within the local police force. A young investigator stood to present, voice steady. "There are at least 3 unresolved complaints, all with Briggs's name on them. Numbers records and forgotten witnesses were now marked in red on the digital board." Naomi sat at the head of the table, listening closely, her eyes cold yet deep, as if seeing a much larger picture behind it all. Her presence on the team was not just procedural. As the one who confronted Briggs face to face, Naomi became a crucial bridge between the exposed evidence and leads yet to be pursued. When she recounted every word and movement from the mall, the entire room seemed to relive the tense moment. A veteran investigator sighed and said, "If not for that video, he would have slipped away again." The words hung in the air, met with nods from all around, because everyone knew that this time it had to go all the way. The meeting ended with the hurried scratching of pens on the official record, and the screech of chairs pushed back. The federal investigative team was officially formed, tasked with reviewing every file from cases left unresolved to complaints once dismissed. Under the bright yellow lights, Naomi stood up, her hand gently tightening around the file held to her chest. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but at least the truth had begun to be rewritten on those first few pages. And this time, justice would not stop halfway. Old files scattered across the archives for years were gathered by the team, cases once buried, now being threaded into a complete picture. Each page, each old testimony, each internal report carried Briggs's trace from vague street checks to arrests that ended in serious injuries. The investigators rearranged everything chronologically, and the links began to appear clearly proven. It wasn't once or twice, but an entire pattern of abuse that had become systematic. The digital board in the conference room glowed red dots, lighting up like bloodstains, forming the path Briggs had walked, leaving behind countless victims who were never protected. Naomi sat quietly in the corner of the room, listening as colleagues presented their preliminary findings. She saw again the faces of past witnesses, cries for justice, buried under bureaucratic excuses. Now they were no longer scattered fragments, but living proof of a past long covered up. One investigator spoke up. Every complaint was dismissed for lack of basis, yet the witness reports were detailed, suggesting interference from within. The room went silent for a few seconds. Then the team leader slammed a hand on the table and declared firmly, "He doesn't get to dodge this anymore." All eyes turned to Naomi because it was her presence that had opened the way for the files to finally be unearthed. Once the chain of evidence was strong enough, the decision to summon Briggs was made that very night. An official document was signed listing his name among the suspects to be questioned. The entire investigative team knew this was a turning point, not just because Briggs had become the center of public outrage, but because having a police officer named as a federal suspect was rare. The lead officer read each line aloud, voice clear. "Officer Briggs is summoned as a suspect in the federal investigation for abuse of power and excessive force." In another room, Briggs sat in a chair, his hands clenched, his face showing clear signs of impatience. When he received the summons, he slammed the paper onto the table, trying to shout at his colleagues that he was innocent, that it was all a setup. But the truth had become a burden, the footage from the mall, the old witnesses, and now the entire chain of files all closing in around him. His phone buzzed, nonstop reporters crowded outside his home, and outside the police station the crowd kept chanting demands for accountability. Briggs was no longer the aggressive man in the shopping mall hallway, but a suspect in the hands of justice, awaiting the long days ahead in which he would face the truth he once believed would stay buried forever. Inside the FBI interview room, white lights cast down onto the long wooden table, the air thick tension and memories awakened after years of silence. One by one, the witnesses stepped in, carrying scars both on their bodies and in their minds. Each testimony echoed heavily, prompting the investigation team to listen intently, typing every word into the record, fully aware of the value held in these long-buried recollections. The first to speak was a black veteran, hair flecked with gray posture, upright, as if military discipline had never left him. He took a deep breath before beginning, his voice hoarse with emotion. He recalled the fateful night years ago when Briggs stopped him on the street without reason, then beat him brutally. He said, "I thought I had fought for this country only to come home and be treated like the enemy on my own soil." His calloused hands clenched tightly, the faded scars on his arms standing as silent testimony to that night. The room fell silent for a few seconds, filled only by the weight of his sigh as he finished his story. Next came a woman, eyes already red, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. As she sat down, she broke into tears before she could speak, needing several moments to compose herself before recounting her experience. She remembered vividly the night Briggs pulled her straight out of her car on a main road, despite her handing over all documents and complying fully. Her voice cracked. "He threw me to the ground like an object right in front of my little girl, crying in the back seat." Tears streamed uncontrollably as she wiped her face with shaky hands. recounting how she was dragged away under the helpless gaze of bystanders, none of whom dared intervene. Her words weighed heavily, causing several investigators to lower their eyes as they took notes in silence. After those first two testimonies, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier as everyone began to grasp just how long the truth had been ignored. Faces once deemed irrelevant now returned to speak through their pain, adding more clarity to the portrait of Briggs. A young investigator looked up, eyes burning with resolve, and whispered, "We owe them the truth." The words didn't leave the room, but they gave the entire team a quiet surge of determination. More witnesses were brought in one after another, but the stories of the veteran and the woman left the deepest mark, clearly illustrating the injustice Briggs had inflicted. These were no longer isolated accusations, but integral pieces reinforcing the entire case, strengthening the evidence to bring him to justice. Naomi, seated silently in the back, nodded gently as each witness spoke, her eyes filled with profound empathy. To her, each account was more than just proof. It was a wake-up call to the system that justice could no longer remain still, not even for a second. When the interviews ended, the room was steeped in heavy silence. The investigators gathered their notes, but in their eyes a new light had appeared, the light of truth slowly taking shape, and the belief that Briggs would not escape justice now that his past had been exposed by the very victims who once stayed silent. As the witness list continued to be called, the atmosphere in the interview room grew denser, as if every word about to be spoken was a blade cutting into the silence that had shielded Briggs for so many years. Men and women, both young and old, took turns sitting in the wooden chair looking directly at the investigation team and recounting their experiences. Each statement seemed isolated, yet once recorded on paper, once those trembling or angry voices echoed one after another, they began to form a collective chain of accusations interwoven like cords, tying Briggs firmly to the wall of truth. Some described being forced to sign falsified reports, others recalled being struck without warning or explanation, and some insisted they had seen Briggs throw evidence into a drain to cover up wrongdoing. These testimonies came from all directions, uncoordinated yet unified into a chorus of outrage. One young man who had been detained for 2 days without cause spoke in a hoarse voice, eyes red from holding back emotion. I knocked on the door dozens of times asking why, but all I got was silence and a contemptuous glare. Another, his hair completely white, spoke in a low, weary tone. Back then, I thought no one would believe me, so I stayed silent. Now, seeing Briggs finally dragged into the light, I have the courage to speak. Every sentence, every word weighed heavily, recorded one after the next like bricks in a wall that could no longer be broken. Naomi sat quietly at the far end of the table, absorbing every detail. To her, each testimony was a fragment of the picture she had long pursued in silence. Now, those fragments aligned on their own, revealing a truth larger than anything she had anticipated. Briggs had not simply made isolated mistakes, he had carved out an entire path of abuse, leaving countless scars on the community. Naomi's eyes shone with resolve, for she understood that these accusations were no longer a personal responsibility, they were the unified voice of forgotten victims demanding to be heard. As the hours-long interview session continued, the electronic board in the adjacent meeting room lit up with a diagram of all related cases. Each data point, each connected line marked in red gradually formed a sharp, full picture. Investigators linked the incidents, cross-checked timelines, and compared witness accounts with past internal findings. Though each case differed in circumstance, a clear pattern emerged. Briggs's fingerprints were on every single one. The evidence map became a massive mirror, reflecting the truth, exposing how he had exploited his authority to conceal, distort, and terrorize the vulnerable. When the large screen lit up with a web of connections, the meeting room fell completely silent. A seasoned investigator tapped a pen against the table and stated firmly, he built an entire chain of abuse, not just isolated acts. The others nodded, their eyes heavy but filled with determination. Naomi took a slow, deep breath as if releasing the weight from her shoulders. She knew that they no longer had to convince anyone of the severity the evidence had spoken for itself. When the session ended, the files stacked high on the table, each page a puzzle piece that helped shape the true portrait of Briggs. No longer seen as a tough-looking officer, he now appeared to all as a systematic abuser of power, leaving behind a long trail of injustice that the public could no longer ignore. That full picture made the entire investigative team realize that this wasn't just the task at hand. It was a chance to spark broader reform where justice would no longer stay behind closed doors but step into the light and belong to everyone. In the FBI interrogation room, fluorescent lights shone down on a cold metal table, and everything was silent as if anticipating an inevitable collision. Briggs sat across his bulky frame, leaning forward, fingers interlocked on the table as if trying to hold on to the last scraps of authority. His voice came out low and rigid, each word brittle. "She made it all up to take me down." His eyes were bloodshot, his gaze drilled into the investigators as if daring them to flinch. But that hostility only exposed his unease because behind the one-way mirror, other eyes were watching his every move, waiting to see when the hardened shell would finally crack. The lead investigator didn't respond right away. He calmly opened a laptop and connected it to the large screen on the wall. A soft click echoed, then the screen lit up. Briggs froze because it was the moment he pulled his gun and the Maul barrel aimed squarely at Naomi's face while she stood still, her gaze calm. The crowd's noise, the screaming, and his own insults played clearly. Every passing second cut deeper into the denial he'd just uttered. Briggs clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white sweat, rising on his forehead, but still forced out a raspy voice. "That's not the full story. You edited it, fabricated all this." The investigator's expression didn't change. He rewound the video, letting the image of Briggs' trembling hand on the gun replay once more. The room was silent, only the repeated footage playing making the air thick with tension. Another agent slid a thick file across the table toward him, stating evenly, "This isn't just a clip. These are witness statements from the veteran to the woman pulled from her car. They all name the same man." Briggs glanced just at the papers, his face flickering with unease, but still shouted, "They're all in on it all, trying to bring me down." The defense sounded desperate, so much so that even he had to pause to gather himself. Naomi entered the room, her footsteps crisp on the tiled floor, and Briggs instinctively looked up. She said nothing, simply stared at him, her gaze icy yet proud. The silence weighed heavier than 1,000 accusations. Briggs twisted in his seat, raising his voice to a near shout. She staged this to look like some hero, but the image on the screen continued to glow, proving to all that he had drawn his weapon, abused his power, and exposed himself before the world. In that moment, his face distorted slightly, fear breaking through the anger, while Naomi stood still, embodying the truth he could no longer deny. The atmosphere in the interrogation room thickened to the point where everyone could feel a turning point had been reached. Briggs' denials, instead of shielding him, only deepened the image of a violent man flailing in desperation. The confrontation had stripped everything bare, and the truth, no longer locked behind a door, had stepped into the light with unstoppable force. Naomi stepped into the interrogation room with the slow, deliberate steps, each sound of her heels echoing on the cold tile floor, making Briggs flinch and look up. The white light from the ceiling cast her shadow long and sharp across the ground like a straight line dividing the room in two. No one offered an introduction, but Naomi's presence alone shifted the air. She stopped directly across from Briggs, her gaze piercing through the fury he tried to project without a single extra movement, without a single word of justification. That look silenced the room. The investigators didn't interrupt, knowing this moment needed no explanation. Briggs sat there attempting a smirk, but the second Naomi's eyes met his, it crumbled, revealing a confusion he could no longer hide. For a few seconds, the space seemed frozen, Naomi's gaze locking him in place. Briggs shifted in his seat, his back pressed tight against the metal chair, hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. The silence didn't give him time to strike back. It became a mirror exposing the truth. He inhaled sharply, sweat beginning to form on his forehead. His eyes darted around the room searching for an ally, but all he found were cold stares. Naomi said nothing, but the calm in her eyes made him feel every layer of denial peeling away. Unable to bear the invisible weight, Briggs shot up from his chair, the screech of metal cutting through the silence. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice cracking into a hoarse yell. "You're all ganging up on me. She's not a hero. She's a damn fraud." His words bounced off the walls, echoing back at him with a force that made him stumble emotionally. He began pacing like a caged animal, arms flailing, eyes bloodshot, his heavy footsteps pounding the floor in chaotic rhythm. The more he shouted, the more his voice broke, stripped of authority, replaced with panic. The investigators remained silent, eyes locked on his unraveling. A seasoned agent scribbled a note, exposing unstable state of mind. Briggs turned toward Naomi, yelling, "You're destroying my life." But her cold stare didn't budge, slicing through the noise like an invisible blade. The louder he screamed, the clearer his fear became. His hands shaking, steps staggering, breath short and ragged. In a matter of moments, the image of the once intimidating officer had vanished, replaced by a man falling apart, crushed by the weight of undeniable truth. The interrogation room remained brightly lit, every witness silently engraving the moment into memory. Naomi didn't need to say another word. Briggs, through his own unraveling, had become the living proof of his downfall. The room fell quiet once more after the outburst, but everyone knew that from this second on the game was over, and the scales of justice had tilted firmly toward the truth. On the day of the official trial, the courtroom was packed, every seat in the public gallery filled with tense faces, reporters, journalists, and people who had followed the case from the beginning. Camera lenses pointed straight at the bench lights, flashing nonstop, like unblinking eyes ready to broadcast every moment to millions watching outside. In that heavy atmosphere, the prosecutor stepped up, placing a thick case file on the table with a weighted thud. He began his presentation with a steady voice, laying out the evidence one by one, from the video footage at the mall to eyewitness accounts and long-buried case files. Each witness called added a piece to the puzzle. Voices trembling, memories soaked in tears, and some sharp and unwavering. Every testimony landed like an arrow, gradually enclosing Briggs within the walls of truth. The air in the courtroom grew dense, the audience silent as the image of Briggs pointing his gun was replayed. His shouting echoed alongside the outcry of the crowd. The prosecutor emphasized this was not just an act of intimidation, but the behavior of someone who has abused power for years. Below, some people clenched their hands, whispers of anger spreading across the room. The pressure from the public was not only outside the courthouse, it filled every wooden bench, every glare aimed squarely at Briggs. When it came time for the defendant to speak, Briggs stood, his face pale, still trying to project toughness. He inhaled deeply and began to push back, his voice rough, blaming Naomi. "She set me up. Everything you saw was part of a script she created to play the hero," he said, eyes scanning the room for support. Briggs repeatedly denied wrongdoing, shifting blame, claiming Naomi had used her position to discredit him, even accusing her of exaggerating everything to ruin the reputation of the local police. His words came fast, desperately building a fragile wall of defense against a flood of evidence. But the more he spoke, the more the room stirred. His repeated baseless justifications only stoked the anger already simmering. The prosecutor waited calmly for him to finish, then replied evenly, "If this was a trap, who put the gun in your hand? If this were a performance, were the dozens of witnesses actors?" Those questions landed like hammers, and Briggs choked on his response, his mouth open but no words coming out. Camera lights zoomed in on his face, capturing the sweat dripping down every tense expression of a man cornered with no escape. Naomi sat in the front row, silently observing. She didn't need, because Usahi, The truth was already speaking for itself. Her eyes were calm, but behind them was an unwavering determination, as if she knew that everything that had happened out there would be fully laid bare in this room. And in the midst of those crowded rows under piercing stares, Briggs was no longer the officer who once shouted orders with a gun in hand, but merely a defendant flailing against the rising tide of justice closing in. The sounds inside the courtroom began to spiral into chaos as Briggs tried to shout over the proceedings, whispers of protest spreading through the gallery, with some people unable to hold back their outrage and cursing aloud. The judge struck the gavel firmly, voice ringing clear across the chamber or in the court. The sharp command instantly settled the noise, but the fury in the eyes of those present remained. Camera lenses zoomed in on each face, capturing the tension and bottled up anger to broadcast live to millions watching outside. After being forced into silence, Briggs lowered his head, hands trembling as they gripped the edge of his seat, but the sweat pouring down his brow said everything words could not. Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had gathered since early morning now spilled into the surrounding streets, carrying banners and shouting thunderous slogans. A giant LED screen in the square streamed the trial live, showing each moment in vivid detail, prompting cheers or boos from the crowd in real time. Chants of justice for all rose above honking horns and beating drums, transforming the entire downtown area into a sea of outrage. That energy spread quickly across television and social media, where millions of posts poured in, all converging on one point: Briggs was finally being exposed and justice was within reach. In cafes, offices, and lecture halls, people followed every twist of the trial. On television, major networks suspended their usual programming to focus entirely on the case. Public pressure intensified by the minute, and each testimony or piece of evidence broadcast instantly sparked new waves of online discussion. Legal experts appeared live on air, breaking down the implications of the FBI formally charging a local police officer and confirming that this moment marked a turning point in the fight against abuse of power. In many other cities, spontaneous marches broke out. Citizens took to the streets carrying images of Naomi holding up her badge, treating it as a symbol of unity. Children wore shirts printed with the word "Unshaken Adults," raised signs bearing the hashtag "Briggs is done." These images appeared simultaneously on TV and online platforms, turning the trial into not just a legal event, but a national flashpoint, one that crossed borders. International newspapers quickly picked up the story, comparing Briggs to past high-profile scandals and praising Naomi as a symbol of courage. Inside the courtroom, the judge maintained a stern tone, instructing everyone to follow proper procedure. Yet he also understood that this trial had long since outgrown the four walls of the courthouse. Millions of eyes, millions of voices had created an invisible pressure, forcing the system to be transparent, forcing every word spoken in court to be weighed as a declaration to the public. Briggs sat still, but surrounding him were crashing waves, from the stares of those in the gallery to the storm of public opinion outside. And at this very moment, the entire country was watching, waiting to see how the truth would be confirmed in a trial that had become an uncontainable national flashpoint. That morning, the courtroom was engulfed in a silence so deep that even the sound of pages turning at the clerk's desk could be heard. The public gallery was packed, all eyes fixed on the judge's bench. No more murmurs, no more protests, only tense anticipation, as if everyone was holding their breath for the moment of judgment. Briggs sat at the defendant's table, shoulders, heavy face, pale eyes avoiding contact, seemingly drained of all strength after days of facing evidence and public scrutiny. Naomi sat at the front, silent, hands neatly clasped on the table, eyes steady and forward, unwavering from beginning to end. The judge entered, his black robe sweeping across the floor. He took his seat and silently scanned the room. His gaze paused briefly on Briggs, then shifted to the thick file before him. After a few seconds of stillness, the sound of the gavel echoed through the chamber, and his voice rang out clearly. The court finds the defendant, Briggs, guilty of abuse of power, assault on a civilian, and hereby strips him of his position permanently. The words hit like thunder, reverberating off the high walls, spreading through the room, prompting the crowd to rise in a wave of exhilaration. Briggs froze in place. He slumped over the table, hands trembling, eyes blank, devoid of the aggression or arrogance he once wore. The image of a police officer who once shouted and pointed a gun at civilians had vanished, replaced by the figure of a man collapsed, stripped of authority. All his previous cries of defense were gone, replaced by an empty stare like someone who had lost everything. The camera zoomed in, capturing the moment to broadcast everywhere as irrefutable proof of his downfall. Outside the gallery, the crowd erupted in applause. People stood and cheered, some embracing as tears streamed down their faces in relief. Small signs pulled from jacket pockets were raised high with the words, "Justice won," clear under the lights. In that moment, the tension of the past days broke free, not just as satisfaction at Briggs's fall, but as a renewed faith in justice. Naomi remained seated, not smiling, not showing excessive joy, only closing her eyes gently for a moment as if to hold on to a quiet peace after the storm. She knew this verdict couldn't erase the pain that had been endured, but at the very least it was proof that justice could be served, that the truth could rise. When she opened her eyes, they remained bright and clear, sending a message that this was only the beginning of a much longer journey. In the stillness of that morning courtroom, the sound of the gavel marked a historic moment, turning Briggs from a man with a gun into a convicted criminal and turning this trial into a victory for an entire community that had long suffered injustice. The moment the verdict was delivered, the courtroom, long tense with anticipation, erupted like thunder. The crowd jumped to their feet, applause echoing loudly, reverberating off the high ceiling and thick walls, crashing like ocean waves. Some people burst into tears, emotion blending with cheers. Others clapped until their hands turned red and still didn't stop. That surging energy spread from the public seating to the area beyond the doors, where the roar of voices poured in like a storm front joining together in a massive chorus of release. For them, this wasn't just the end of a trial, it was a turning point, a reason to believe that justice, though delayed, could still speak with power. Reporters quickly captured the scene, cameras sweeping across the room to catch every beaming face, every tearful embrace from those who had waited so long for this moment. An elderly woman, her hair silver, clutched her daughter's hand and whispered, "At last, we've seen justice." In another corner, a group of students held up phones to live stream the words, "Justice won," scrolling across their screens, racking up thousands of hearts from viewers watching online. Each round of applause wasn't just a celebration of the verdict, but a message of solace to every past victim who had once stayed silent in the dark, reminding them that today they stood in the light of truth. Naomi sat quietly in the front row, not swept up in the fervent celebration. As the room erupted in cheers, she simply closed the folder in front of her hands, resting calmly, eyes steady like a river after a storm. Her expression was composed, not showy, but lit by the quiet strength that had carried her through the journey. For Naomi, the applause ringing out beyond was necessary for the community, but what she focused on ran deeper, the need to ensure that justice would be upheld beyond today. When the court bell sounded to signal the end of the session, Naomi stood, adjusted her posture, and walked between the rows of clapping onlookers. Cameras immediately followed, capturing her measured steps, sending that image to millions of screens beyond. No one pushed or crowded her path. Instead, the room hushed for a few beats as she neared the door, as if acknowledging the calm dignity she carried. Outside the courthouse, the midday sun spilled across the steps. As Naomi stepped out, the cheers rose again, but she only nodded slightly, her expression unchanged, as if to send a message that joy must not stop at the verdict of one individual, but should carry forward through reforms to prevent such tragedies from repeating. Amid the sea of people raising their signs, Naomi kept walking steadily, her eyes gazing into the distance as if searching for what still needed to be done. In the the thunderous noise, her calm presence stood out even more, prompting many to snap photos and share them instantly with the caption, "The woman who didn't waver." The story didn't end in triumph, but began anew with a symbolic image reminding everyone that justice does not arrive solely in applause, but must be upheld through steadfast resolve and lasting action. The central square that evening turned into a sea of light with thousands of candles lit by citizens lined up beneath a large white banner printed in bold letters, "Justice Won't Kneel." A quiet stillness blanketed the space as the usual city sounds seemed to retreat, giving way to solemnity and a profound sense of unity. Each flickering candle was more than just light. It was a voice, a symbol of renewed belief after a long storm. Children nestled beside their parents' eyes, fixed on the trembling flames as if receiving a vivid lesson on courage and justice. Around the square, large panels displayed the image of Naomi holding up her FBI badge in the mall, brightly illuminated by floodlights. It was no longer just a single moment, but the emblem of an entire movement. People paused to look up at that composed face, those unwavering eyes, then took photos and posted them online with messages full of pride. A circle of students stood together, phones in hand, replaying the original footage in silence. Many cried when the frame showed Naomi standing tall beneath the barrel of a gun. In every gaze, there was admiration, gratitude, and a realization that justice needs to be resolved to stand unshaken. Throughout the vigil, there were murmurs, quiet conversations recounting that day. People recalled every detail not to stir anger, but to underline the power of truth. An older man slowly said to his grandchild, "Sometimes silence can outlast bullets." Others around him listened and nodded, their eyes glowing in the candlelight. Painful memories had been transformed into energy, into a collective reminder that change can begin with a single act as long as it's carried by conviction and belief. On a makeshift stage in the middle of the square, a group of community artists performed a song written for the event, its rising melody moving many to tears. Between the music, the host repeated a phrase that had spread everywhere: "Dignity cannot be erased by a pulled trigger." The crowd echoed it in unison, their voices rising into the night, reverberating against the tall buildings surrounding them. In that moment, everyone felt they were no longer alone, but part of a collective bound by a shared longing for justice. That echo extended far beyond the square. The event was broadcast out with millions of people in other cities watching and lighting candles in front of their screens. On social media, images from the vigil appeared everywhere, each photo serving as proof trust had been restored. Naomi did not appear on stage, but her presence was felt in every candle, every picture, every song, like a thread binding everything together. The vigil ended in solemn silence, with the last candles still burning, leaving behind a gentle glow, like a promise that justice would continue to be protected, never kneeling to violence. Among the shimmering sea of candles, quiet conversation spread across the square. People leaned in, repeating the moment. Naomi stood firm in front of the gun barrel, unshaken, unmoved. An elderly man nodded and said to someone beside him, she wasn't afraid of the gun. That seemingly simple line quickly echoed through many groups, passed from person to person, until it became a unified chant to the crowd. No one took it merely as a comment, but rather as a declaration that Naomi's actions had transcended herself, becoming proof of the strength of courage. Young faces looked to one another, eyes lighting up as if a new belief was forming inside them that dignity could stand firmer than any weapon. The media did not miss that moment. The next morning, headlines across numerous newspapers read in bold print, "She wasn't afraid of the gun." Editorials delved deeper, affirming that this event had become a landmark where one individual stood on behalf of an entire community against abuse of power. From that simple phrase, the press turned it into a slogan that spread through the streets, appearing on banners, t-shirts, and hastily painted murals overnight. On social media, media, millions of posts shared the same message, with the image of Naomi raising her badge, paired with those words turning it into an enduring symbol of resistance and belief. In cafes, conversations stretched late into the day circling around a single topic. People recounted what they felt watching the video, seeing a woman remain calm amidst violence. One young voice said, "If she can stand tall in front of a gun, then we can stand tall in the face of injustice." The table fell into thoughtful silence, then nodded together. In classrooms, teachers brought the case into lessons. Students debated passionately, and many wrote reflections about wanting to become someone who speaks up when something is wrong. From a single act, the story spread across generations, planting seeds of bravery and faith in justice within them. Gradually, the story was no longer confined to the Briggs case, but retold as a shared symbol. Vigils, marches, and newly written songs all drew inspiration from the moment Naomi stood in the middle of the shopping mall. In the public eye, she was not a cold federal agent, but the woman who turned composure into strength, whose steady gaze became a banner for a movement. On many large walls, her image was painted in bright tones with slogans below like "Justice won't kneel" or "She wasn't afraid." These murals quickly became gathering spots where people paused, took photos, and shared them online, spreading more life into the symbol that had just been born. That night, even as the last candle burned out, the echo hadn't ended. People left the square, but the story followed them with every step, in every post-dinner conversation, in the stream of status updates. "She wasn't afraid of the gun" was no longer comment, but a reminder for everyone to reflect on themselves, to understand that change begins with courage. And in that way, the story extended beyond the courtroom, beyond a single incident, becoming a living emblem of justice, etched into collective memory as a promise that no one would ever again have to bow to senseless violence. In the wide lecture hall of a law school, light from the projector cast across a stretched white screen covering the wall, replaying the video clip that had become a national focal point. The crowded classroom of students sat in absolute silence, every eye fixed on the moment Naomi stood in front of the gun calm, then raised her FBI badge. The usual hum of a packed class vanished, leaving only the sound of the video and the pounding heartbeats of young people witnessing a historic moment unfold before their eyes. These young faces, once familiar only with legal theory on paper, now encountered a vivid truth where justice was no longer an abstract concept, but the deliberate action of one person. When the clip ended, the room remained silent for a few seconds, the atmosphere thick, as if no one dared to breathe. The gray-haired professor, who had spent a lifetime studying the law, stepped toward the lectern, his voice low and steady. "Remember this? Well, power must be kept in check, and justice must never be subdued." He paused, scanning the room of hundreds of students as if to engrave each word. His remark was more than a lesson. It was a warning, a reminder that law loses its meaning without oversight and the courage of those willing to stand up. Several hands went up, not to ask technical questions, but to share what they felt. One student stood, voice trembling but eyes bright. "Professor, I used to think justice belonged to the courts and to people in authority. But today I realize it begins with the choices of individuals." Naomi showed us that. The class murmured in agreement, followed by applause, and the room lit up like a public forum. Another student added, "If one agent can do that, then we can do our part to prevent injustice wherever we live." The professor smiled, listening closely, letting the thoughts of this generation flow freely. He knew this moment mattered more than any lecture, for it planted the understanding that law lives not just on paper, but in every action, every decision made by people. The bright eyes across the room proved that Naomi's lesson had extended far beyond a single case, becoming a compass for young people to see that justice is a fire that must be kept alive, never allowed to go out. As the class ended, many students lingered, murmuring among themselves, their eyes lit with excitement and reflection. On the large screen, the final line remained. power must be kept in check. Justice must never be subdued. It stood as a message for an entire generation standing at the threshold, reminding them they were not merely students of law, but the ones who would bring justice into everyday life. And in that very lecture hall, the story's resonance moved beyond a single case, becoming a flame passed from one generation to the next, helping young people understand the responsibility and strength they now held in their hands. After the professor's remarks, the quiet atmosphere burst into a wave of lively discussion. Hands shot up, students stood to speak with the passion typical of youth. One firmly argued that the legal system cannot rely solely on internal oversight, that it needs community participation and individual courage to speak out against injustice. Another countered that the law does have mechanisms in place, but they are often exploited, and it is the new generation's responsibility to ensure those mechanisms are not twisted. The back and forth heated up, turning the lecture hall into a kind of courtroom where justice was examined through every argument. Debate filled the room. No one stayed seated. Some groups stood and cited historical examples, and others referenced statutes to back up their points. Every word carried a desire to contribute to prove their generation did not learn the law just to memorize its terms, but to face reality and change it. On the faces of these young people was determination, the light of belief, and above all, unity in the idea that justice must be protected by those who inherit it. In that passionate energy, Naomi's name came up again and again. A female student raised her voice. If Naomi could stand in front of a gun without fear, we can stand in front of silence and speak the truth. The line was met with loud applause, many students nodding their eyes, shining as if they had found a mirror for their own paths. Naomi wasn't in the classroom, but her image wove through every argument, every statement, a vivid example of what they were all discussing. The professor smiled as he listened to his students debate, knowing this was the moment when the lecture hall transcended its role as a place of instruction. It had become a forum where the next generation shaped their convictions and built a sense of duty. Naomi was not seen as a distant figure, but as a close symbol of the resilience anyone could embody. The applause and cheering proved the invisible connection between that brave woman and the students now sitting beneath this school's roof. As the class ended, many students continued their discussions in the hallway, their animated voices trailing all the way down the steps leading to the campus courtyard. On their lips, Naomi's name was repeated often, paired with words like role model, inspiration, and lesson. In that moment, it seemed Naomi had entered their minds not just as a federal agent, but as a symbol of inner strength and integrity. And from that very classroom, an unspoken promise began to take shape that this generation would carry forward the flame of justice, a flame passed down from the example of a woman who dared to face a gun to affirm the value of human dignity. Inside the state capitol building, an emergency session was convened, the atmosphere so tense that every footstep echoed through the halls. Nearly all legislators were present. Stacks of dense documents on the Briggs case and its aftermath lay before them. Images from the trial, the protests, and the candlelight vigil in the square played continuously on a large screen, a constant reminder that public pressure allowed no delay. When the chair struck the gavel to open the session, murmurs rippled through the chamber, everyone aware this would be a turning point. The first bill brought forward for discussion was a mandate requiring all police officers in the state to wear body cams during every shift. A legislator stood up, voice firm. We've witnessed too many cases fade into the shadows for lack of evidence. The death of a public trust begins with opacity, and now we have a chance to end it. The statement was met with swift support, hands banging on tables in agreement. Another lawmaker added that body cams were not just tools of accountability, but protection for officers who fulfill their duties with integrity. The debate was intense, but largely unified, and when the vote came, nearly every hand went up, passing the bill by an overwhelming majority. Applause erupted throughout the chamber, a rare moment when politics aligned fully with the will of the people. Immediately after the next issue arose reopening old cases previously dismissed or shelved for lack of evidence. Dust-covered case files were brought to the table, many tied to long-standing silence and injustice. A young female legislator stepped forward, eyes bright, voice resolute. Every forgotten case is an open wound. If we want to restore trust, we must start by shedding light on those dark corners. The room stirred with reaction as everyone understood this effort could threaten powerful interest, but public pressure had overtaken political hesitation. In the end, the resolution passed and a special committee was formed to review each case, ensuring that long-ignored victims would have another chance to speak. Journalists in the chamber rapidly documented every detail, and the news spread like wildfire. Outside the building, the crowd, watching via large screens, erupted in cheers when they heard the body cam bill, Hassai, and old cases would be reopened. Applause rang out. People cried, some overcome by the weight of long-awaited justice. A man whispered to his son, "This is what I've waited for all these years. Now you'll get to see a different kind of world." Inside the chamber, lawmakers concluded the session with a rare consensus. They knew these decisions would not erase the pain overnight, but they marked the beginning of restoring lost trust. From the Briggs case, a door to reform had opened, allowing justice not to end with a single verdict, but to live on through every new policy and law. And as the last light of day fell across the Capitol building, it also illuminated the path society was determined to follow, a path where truth would no longer be buried in silence. As the first bills were passed, the atmosphere in the state capitol remained tense, with many legislators recognizing that new measures would fall short without an independent oversight mechanism. After hours of debate, a proposal to establish an oversight committee was introduced, and this time, strong support came even from previously hesitant voices. An elderly legislator rose his voice firm. "We need a body free from entanglements to observe, to remind, to intervene when power is abused. Without it, every law remains just ink on paper." His words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement. A decision was swiftly made. The Independent Oversight Committee was officially established, composed of lawyers, scholars, community representatives, and human rights organizations. They were not part of any law enforcement agency, but operated as society's third eye. Their authority was clearly defined. They could initiate investigations, require police departments to release data, and submit direct recommendations to the courts when necessary. The structure was immediately praised by the public as a groundbreaking move, breaking the long-standing cycle in which internal investigations were often compromised from within. Outside the Capitol, news of the Oversight Committee spread like a new wave. Crowds gathered around large screens, and when the announcement was made, they erupted into applause, many embracing, as if witnessing the opening of a new door for society. On social media, phrases like "finally independent" and "eyes of justice" were shared repeatedly, becoming symbols of renewed hope. For the community, the committee's existence wasn't just a legal measure, it was a public promise that truth would no longer be silenced. The momentum led many commentators to call the day a historic turning point. They noted that after years of suffering from abuse of power, society now had a real mechanism for self-defense. Young people saw it as proof that their voices mattered, and those who had once remained silent in the face of injustice felt less alone. Images of lawmakers shaking hands on the floor spread quickly, symbolizing unity, even among those previously divided. From those decisions, society turned a new page. Schools began incorporating the story of Naomi and the Briggs case into their curriculum as a clear example of justice and reform. Communities organized forums to discuss discuss oversight of law enforcement, and ordinary citizens saw themselves as having a direct role in defending the truth. Memorial gatherings no longer carried the weight of outrage, but became moments to remind each other that justice is the foundation on which trust is built. That evening, in front of the Capitol building, thousands of candles were lit once more, but this time not only to honor victims, but to celebrate the beginning of a new path. In the flickering light, people whispered to one another that they had witnessed real change, a change written into law, protected by oversight and fueled by courage. And from that moment on, the belief that justice could stand strong became a lived reality, allowing society to move forward with a hope brighter than ever before. Late at night, the city lay beneath long stretches of amber streetlights like roads paved with memory. Naomi stood alone on her apartment balcony, cold wind weaving through her hair, carrying a heavy silence. Below, the sparse traffic drifted by the distant hum of engines, reminding her of the chaos that had passed, of that moment in the mall forever etched in her mind. The image of the gun barrel, inches from her face, surged back, vivid enough that she could hear the cold metallic ring, hear Briggs shout, and feel every pounding beat of her heart in that split second of tension. That moment had not faded with time, but became part of her breath, returning each night as a quiet reminder of the thin line between life and death. Naomi leaned on the railing, eyes fixed on the dimming lights at the horizon. She knew many saw her courage as instinct, but to her it was the clearest moment of conscious control. In that fraction of a second, with the gun so close, she realized fear, if allowed to dominate, would make her submit. Calm was her only weapon to stay in control, to speak with clarity, to shake Briggs in front of the crowd. She whispered inwardly, "It wasn't the gun that decided, it was my steady silence." That memory didn't bring Naomi pride, but a deep stillness. She knew she wasn't a superhero. The fear was still there, but she had simply chosen not to follow it. What held her steady wasn't her FBI title, but the belief that justice had to be claimed through deliberate action. The more she thought about it, the more she understood that calm is the truest form of courage. No outburst, no show, but strong enough to push violence back. Out on the balcony, the night wind was biting, yet Naomi felt a clarity within. She knew the journey behind her was only the beginning, that many trials lay ahead. But that lesson was engraved in her heart: when danger arrives, one doesn't need to shout to prove anything, only to keep the heart from trembling. She smiled faintly, eyes drifting toward the distance, letting the wind carry away the heavy remnants. In that moment, Naomi realized that the greatest strength doesn't lie in tools or power, but in the ability to remain calm even as the world collapses around you. And for her, that was the silent promise to keep walking the path of justice, a path with no room for fear, but always in need of unwavering composure. Naomi stood still before the deep expanse of the city, the glow from the streetlights below cast in her face in a mix of shadow and light, half hidden, half revealed. In that moment, she thought about everything she had been through, about the flood of praise calling her a hero, about the articles placing her in the role of a symbol. But deep down, Naomi knew that titles weren't what made a person strong. She didn't need a medal, didn't need a label to affirm her worth, because her actions at the mall had already said everything. It was the choice to stay calm, instead of afraid to face forward, instead of stepping back, that proved justice could always be protected if someone dared to stand up. The cold wind blew stronger, lifting the small papers still resting on the railing. Naomi closed her eyes gently, letting her thoughts guide her. She saw clearly that no matter how loud or dazzling titles were temporary, while actions rooted in true belief would live on in the memory of the community. The image of her raising her badge in front of a gun wasn't meant to prove she was an agent, but to show that truth can stand tall even when facing violence. And it was that act that became the spark, spreading far beyond any job title or position. Naomi, opened her eyes, her gaze drifting far into the night sky where stars shimmered in the vast dark. She understood that what she had done was only the beginning, that many more battles lay ahead, battles not always caught on camera, not always seen by the world. But deep inside, she quietly promised herself she wouldn't stop. She would continue to fight for justice, not with loud slogans, but with steady action, with each firm step on a long road. That promise didn't need to be declared, didn't need to be written down. It rested quietly in her heart, echoing as a gentle yet unwavering reminder. Naomi placed a hand on her chest, as if etching that silent vow into each heartbeat. The night wind still blew cold, but in her chest the warmth of resolve rose strong. To her, justice wasn't a destination, but a journey, one that would face many difficult turns. But as long as she held on to her belief, kept calm as her weapon, she knew she would have the strength to keep going. From that balcony, Naomi looked down at the vast city, quietly listening to the rhythm of life continuing on, and she smiled. It wasn't a radiant smile, but it was enough to show she had chosen her path. The path where titles didn't matter, where only action was the true voice, and where a silent promise to justice would lead her forward. 1 year later, the shopping mall that was once a scene of chaos now wore a new face, not because of its storefronts or bright advertisements, but because of a massive mural stretching from the ground floor all the way up to the glass dome. In the mural, Naomi stood tall, facing the barrel of a gun, her eyes calm and resolute, her face showing no fear but radiating the strength of conviction. The colors of the mural were boldly composed with dark tones in the background, emphasizing the light emanating from the badge in her raised hand, as if the entire space around it had been captured by that single moment. People stopped in front of the wall, some took photos, some stood silently for a long time, and all felt a quiet surge of strength from that image. On the evening of the anniversary, the small square in front of the mall was packed. People came from many places carrying small candles, placing them carefully beneath the mural as a gesture of tribute. The flickering candlelight blended with the city's lights, creating a gentle sea of brightness that filled the entire space. Inside the circle, children gathered listening as parents and grandparents told the story of the woman who stood tall in the face of violence, not just to protect herself, but to help society recognize the value of justice. The children's eyes lit up at times, wide with wonder, at times nodding in admiration as if the story had planted an unforgettable seed within them. The adults whispered to each other, recounting familiar details, yet each retelling carried fresh emotion. Someone said the mural wasn't just art, but a witness, a reminder that truth may be buried for a moment, but will always rise again with strength. Another placed a hand on his son's shoulder and said softly, "Remember, courage doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand firm." Those words, carried on the night air, became a shared echo, linking generations through a simple but profound belief. Journalists, photographers, and documentary teams were also present, capturing the moment for posterity. They understood that this event was no longer just a personal story, but a collective legacy. Naomi did not appear at the memorial, but her image was everywhere on the massive wall, in the flickering candles, and the words spoken by the community. And it was this absence that made the legacy even more enduring, because it proved the story no longer belonged to one person, but to everyone. As night fell, the last candle still burned, lighting the faces of those who remained. High above the mural stood tall, as if to affirm that Naomi's resolve would live on through the years. A year had passed, but the resonance remained not fading, but growing, so that from this place, the story of courage and justice would continue to spread as a living legacy of our time. From the memorial night at the shopping mall, a new slogan began to emerge. First, scribbled on a small sign by a student, then spreading across street corners and social media, "Silence can defy." The bold, bold, white letters on a black background, simple yet powerful, became a message everyone wanted to share. They appeared on posters, T-shirts, and banners hung in front of schools, courthouses, and neighborhoods. No lengthy explanation was needed, just the words themselves. Steadfast silence when held in a defining moment could become a force against violence. The image of Naomi standing still before the gun became inseparable from the slogan, making it no longer abstract but a living, breathing testament. Social commentators analyzed that silence can defy didn't promote passivity, but honored the strength of calm, of self-control in the face of rage and fear. On television, a scholar affirmed, "This is what the younger generation needs to remember, because strength isn't always in the shout. Sometimes it's the silence, the composure that makes those in power afraid." That explanation was quickly clipped into a short video and shared alongside the slogan, adding even more reach and depth to the message. The new slogan didn't stay within the bounds of language. It became a glue that bonded communities. In peaceful marches, people held up signs reading, "Silence can defy their eyes, steady their steps firm." In schools, teachers used the slogan to introduce lessons on ethics and law, encouraging students to reflect on the inner strength of human character. In families, parents told their children Naomi's story, ending with the slogan as a lesson to carry forward. From the streets to classrooms, from stories to memories, everything joined to form the current of a message that could not be extinguished. And then, as time settled, what remained in the collective memory was not just the trial, not just the protests, but the meaning distilled into one final message. Justice can be silent, but it never bowed. People understood that justice doesn't always roar through drums' chants or the gavel strike, but sometimes exists in quiet persistence and courage that doesn't need to announce itself. Naomi proved that truth, and the community turned it into a legacy to pass on to the generations to come. On the final night of the memorial, as the candles still burned brightly beneath the mural, a group of children recited aloud in unison, "Silence can defy." That innocent chorus echoed through the night, bringing a hush over the adults, many of whom raised their hands to wipe away tears. In that moment, everyone realized the message had outgrown a single event, becoming a shared vow. Justice, though it may be silent, always stands tall, and as long as people hold on to their belief in it, it will never be subdued. 1 year had passed since the day a gun was pointed directly at Naomi Carter's face in the middle of the shopping mall, but the echoes of the story still lived on in every retelling, in every piece of collective memory. It did not end with Briggs's sentence, nor with the marches or the reforms, but opened a new path where people clearly saw the power of justice when upheld with determination. Naomi had left the courtroom with a composed expression, but the mark she left behind became a legacy etched into the massive wall and into the hearts of millions. That story turned what seemed like a moment of tragedy into a flame that reignited belief. It showed that courage does not always come with outbursts, but sometimes lives in composure and eyes that do not look away from violence. People remember Naomi not for her title as an agent, but because she chose to face down fear in silence to prove that calmness can overcome even shouting and the barrel of a gun. That very choice gave rise to the slogan, "Silence can defy," spreading far and wide as a spiritual banner for generations. The greatest lesson drawn from this journey is that justice must be preserved not only through laws, but through human will. When a community stands together, when witnesses find the courage to break their silence, the truth is pulled from the shadows. The name Briggs is no longer a symbol of unchecked power, but a warning to those who believe authority can shield wrongdoing. Every reopened case, every camera mounted on an officer's chest is proof that society has changed at its core because of one unexpected moment. Naomi also left left behind a quiet but powerful message for the younger generation. In lecture halls, her story is replayed as the starting point for debates about dignity and responsibility. Students no longer see justice as something distant but as an action that can begin with themselves. Naomi's composure became a mirror showing each person that they too can be part of change, even through a single steady act. From these lessons, viewers may find inspiration to face the challenges of life. Justice does not always appear in full brightness like daylight. Sometimes it must be protected through quiet steps, through patience and unwavering belief. Naomi proved that truth can be silent, yet that very silence can carry farther than any shout because it is upheld by action and steady faith. When looking back at the whole story, people do not only remember Briggs collapsing in the courtroom, but also the image of a united community lighting candles together and chanting the slogan together. That is proof that justice is never the responsibility of a single person, but the result of collective unity. And it was this unity that allowed society to turn a new page, where those who abuse power can no longer hide easily, and where victims are heard and protected. This ending is not a final period, but a statement that justice is always present even when it chooses silence. Naomi Carter stepped out of the shopping mall that day not with the posture of a victor, but with the stance of someone guarding dignity. That image will be remembered for many years as a reminder that justice may arrive late, may stay silent, but has never been defeated. And to every person who witnesses this story, the final lesson is to believe that in the moment that seems the weakest, calmness and determination can become the strength to change the world.